Welcome to this final segment of Introduction to Native Plant Gardening in Central Arizona with a focus on the low deserts. In this segment, we're going to look at design and maintenance. The topics we'll cover in this workshop are looking at some design principles and plant selection for a native garden in the low desert. We'll look at timing of planting, soils, irrigation, and pruning, so important maintenance aspects of the garden. And we'll talk also about some ideas about thinking about climate change adaptation in our region. First, let's talk about some design principles when you're getting ready to work within your space, whether it's big or small. I think observation and lots of it is a really important principle because it takes time to get to know a space, and spaces change over time. You know, you have the seasonality, the angle of the sun changes. You have different areas in a potential yard might have different microclimates. Some might be hotter, some might be cooler, some might be sunnier, some might be shadier. And really observing and seeing what you have to work with, I think is important. So I've done a lot of observation. I had a native garden that you can see pictured there that I started with in 2011, and it took me quite a while to really think about, you know, what to do with this space and to get to know the different parts of the space. And then observation paired with your intentions. What do you really want your space to be? Do you want your space to be a space that is very ultra low maintenance? So that's going to really drive a lot of what you do. Or do you want a space that is maybe focused on supporting birds? That's going to be a different kind of space. So those two things, I think, really drive a lot of what you might do in your garden design. And now I'm going to suggest a few ways to think about designing your space. And one of them is by water use zones. There are 3 zones, and you could think about these zones as moving further and further away from the home. The oasis is going to be the closest space to the home, transitional further out, and xeric the most further out space. And in the oasis zone, you're going to have the plants that have the highest water needs, and they're going to be the most easily accessible from the house with a hose or something like that, or taking watering cans out, which will make it easier, especially in the hotter times, to water that space. And that would be a high use space with lots of plants, some of them being perhaps some of your most water needy plants. And then the transitional zone moves a step away from that, and that's going to have a range of plants, but with varying needs, but they won't be as water needy as what's in the oasis zone. And then finally, in the xeric zone, furthest away from the house, that's going to be the area that gets the least maintenance and maybe the least visitation by members of the family. And that space would have your most xeric, your most drought-resistant plants, the ones that need the most minimal maintenance. So water use zones is one way to think about designing your space. You could also look at thinking about your space in terms of the levels vertically. So going from top to bottom, at the top you would have your tallest trees, the highest, the canopy, essentially. And those trees are going to provide filtered shade to what's below. And then underneath those, you might have what's called understory trees or patio trees that are slightly shorter than your canopy, but you have that as sort of a next layer. Then underneath that, you have shrubs, which are kind of in a mid-zone, and some perennials of different heights, ground covers that are much lower. And then you're going to have vines that take up a vertical element in the space. And then you also would think about some of your larger cacti, which could reach the canopy level over time, such as saguaro. So think about multi-layer. And this is important too, going to another theme about diversity. The more diversity that you build in your space, the more types of animals that can utilize that space and in different ways. So think about a layered design. You can also pair that with water use zones. You could also think about rooms, like maybe you want some different spaces in your yard, and you can create them with walls, or you could create them with living walls, such as a hedge of shrubs. For example, I have a space that I call the secret patio because I put a really heavy planting of shrubs in that space that surrounds it, so that when you're sitting there, you feel like you're kind of walled off from the rest of the garden as kind of a hidden, quiet reflection space. So think about how you can build in some different rooms, and you can also do those things to block views that you don't want to see as well. And now, a really important principle for designing for wildlife is to have something always in bloom. So thinking about what are some plants that are long bloomers, or what are some plants that are blooming in the times that are usually the most lean, such as the winter time or late summer, especially if there haven't been monsoons. Those are some times to think about, making sure there's always something in bloom, and having a diversity of plants are important principles. Even if you start small, you can add over time, and we don't have to have hundreds of species, but having more than just a couple of species will bring more wildlife to your yard and allow you to support more wildlife, really. And then planting in clumps is a related idea, and that is that many of the pollinators, such as butterflies, are going to be more easily able to see your plants if they're in larger clumps. So having 3 or 4 milkweeds together versus having separated apart in the yard is going to make it easier for butterflies to kind of zone in on those and recognize that they're there. So those are some principles, and another principle comes from Doug Tallamy, where he advocates that we should aim for up to 70% of what we're planting to be native, and try to keep the non-natives to a smaller percentage. So those are some design principles to think about, all of which can be brought into planning together. So now, plant selection. This is a really important principle, the right plant for the right place. I really can't emphasize it enough. I found that I made a lot of mistakes along these lines, and it was kind of costly for my time and energy to have to move plants because they weren't in the right place. And some of the components of thinking about what constitutes the right plant for a space is, what is the exposure like, what type of sunlight it have, what you have in shade, or is going to be very different than what you want to put on a western exposure, for example. What's the size at maturity? Check some of the guides that are available online. The Municipal Water Users book that they have on landscape design is one that gives a lot of good figures on size at maturity. What can I expect the height and the width of this plant to be? And I would anticipate it could get a little bit bigger than any of the information online may tell you. This happened to me a lot, especially with shrubs. They grew the size I expected, and they were too big in the space. So size at maturity plus add a little bit on to be safe, especially if they're on drip. And that brings us to something about watering, to think about, okay, what kind of watering regime is available in this location? Am I going to have to hand water? Is this a spot that I'm going to have to drag water out to quite a bit in the summertime? Or is it a spot that's on automatic irrigation, and so I can program that in? Because especially in the summer, that's important. If you're going to be on vacation a lot in the summer when the plants need water the most, how are they going to get that? So thinking about that in different spaces. And again, that can go back to those water use zones too, and planning for that will really be helpful. And then neighboring plants and what your overall design and intentions are. Are there certain groupings of plants that you enjoy? Some of the Mary Irish books are really good at talking about like how to blend perennials and succulents and things like that. And some folks have different aesthetic, preferences. Like I've come to really enjoy orange flowered plants beside purple flowered plants. I just find it to be something I really like. So you might find, different combinations that you like. And in the picture there is one of the penstemons, and since those flowers are just so beautiful, I like to make sure that I plant that in a space that I'm going to see those, and that's going to be really important for plants that maybe you really need a close-up view of, or plants that are fragrant. You want to have them in places that they're going to be able to be viewed and enjoyed, maybe near a walkway. Timing of planting in the low desert. This seems counterintuitive if you've come from other parts of the country, but here, fall is the best planting time. And the reason why is because the soil is still warm from having gone through our very long summer, which allows the roots to develop fully, which is the most important thing when plants are first transplanted, is they need to develop a good root system. But the other reason fall is a good time is because it's giving plants the most broadest interval before they have to deal with the next summer's heat. So that's why we typically plant in the fall, and September and December are, that's really the range. For me, I usually don't start planting until late September, and I watch the temperatures and try to look to see if they're starting to downwardly trend outside of the triple digits for planting. I think that's important because they're going to face quite a bit of stress when they first go in. So I typically do most of my planting in October, but I do sometimes start in late September. But those are some considerations about planting. Another concept is about some of our species are actually frost sensitive, and they need a little more time to get squared away before the possibility of frost. So those are ones you might want to start with. If you're going to start planting in September, start with some of those first. And then I find spring planting to be very tricky. There's not a lot of time for the plants to get adapted and settled in prior to the heat. I've had much more plant loss in the spring, and when I plant in the spring, those that are planted in spring, I've lost quite a bit of those over their first summer. And I find that I have to do a lot of watering. That was particularly true this past summer where we had very hot temperatures for long periods of time. I really was watering some of my new plants almost daily, which was just too much. So let's talk about soil and soil amendments. The native plants in our region evolved to the soils of our region. So typically you don't need to do a tremendous amount of building of the soil or adding fertilizer for the most part. There are some exceptions. If you're interested in trying to grow some slightly higher elevation plants, or plants that are maybe a little more tender because they come from more protected spaces like a canyon or riparian area, or wetter or moister protected environments, then you might want to think about adding some compost. What you could do is just add a small amount of compost into that bed or just within the planting hole of those specific plants. I've done that with some of the milkweeds that are just slightly higher elevation or a little bit more tender, like Arizona milkweed. I have added richer soil to that potting, the plant hole that those plants have gone into. So that's something to think about. Mary Irish does recommend to consider. She has about 4 inches of compost every year that she creates in-house in her own garden. So that's a possibility, is if you have the means to and energy to be adding compost. I personally don't do that because I have gravel as my mulch, and that would be a big job to move that all out of the way to add in compost. So that's not something I do, and I don't know that it's necessary, but it is something that she's had a lot of success with, and she writes about. One thing you might want to do, and I do this especially when I'm planting trees prior to planting them, is I do a drainage test and make sure that the drainage is adequate. A lot of our native desert plants do require good drainage. So what you can do is dig a hole about 1 by 1, fill it up, and see how long it takes to drain. If it drains within about 2 hours, you're okay. You can improve the drainage by adding some sharp sand or gravel into those planting holes. If you have drainage problems in larger areas, you could potentially do that in whole beds. There are also some other techniques that relate to xeriscaping called contouring, shaping the land to improve drainage, or growing in raised beds can raise drainage or improve drainage as well. So now let's talk about irrigation. This is a tough topic to give any sort of recommendations, but I will attempt to give some general recommendations. They're always going to vary depending on the situation locally in your space. But an important principle is that just because a plant is drought tolerant or xeric does not mean it can survive on no water at all. Although some of the most xeric, such as of course a lot of our cacti and plants like brittle-bush that are really, and creosote that are really xeric, they can survive on rainwater alone, assuming that we get rainwater and assuming that they're already established. So those are some principles. And so those are some of the plants you could put in what we were talking about as the xeric zone in your yard furthest away from the house. But just keep in mind that plants, if there hasn't been rain for an extended period, they're going to need some help, of course, especially in the summer. I find that drip irrigation is best. That's what I use because it delivers the water right to where the plant needs it. So if you have that, or you can put that in, that would be ideal. It also gives you the, the option not to have to worry, when you go on vacation, you can program it. Watering deeply is really important, especially for trees. They should be watered infrequently and deeply in order to make sure that their roots are developing deep in the ground, which will prevent blowovers like in storms. There's a good source from Water Use It Wisely, Landscape Watering by the Numbers, which is a good source that you can Google that gets into a lot of detail about drip irrigation and programming and guidance for irrigation. But I will offer this from Mary Irish about newly planted plants. So picture a fall planting like we discussed, and then water deeply about once a week. And then as we come into winter, you can drop down to every 2 to 3 weeks. And then in spring, increase to weekly. And then watch for those triple digits, because that's when you want to get into the mode of watering a couple times a week. And then reduce again in fall and winter and continue that cycle through the seasons. So that's a real general principle. There's going to be a lot that's going to, influence what your irrigation should be like in your space. And observation is one of the most important ways you can determine what your plants need. With pruning, there are different schools of thought. For me, when it comes to the native shrubs particularly, I am a minimalist. I definitely don't do any shearing. You see a lot of that in the commercial plantings like, industrial parks or corporate offices where they do a lot of just shearing the plant down. And what that does is it takes away the natural beauty of the plant, and it does create stress, and it will cut down on flowering and seed set. So I really don't recommend shearing at all. And for me personally, I only prune branches that get in the way, are in the way of a pathway, or they might be diseased, or they might be dying. So I'm really selective in pruning, and I prune very, very selectively. Some people do pruning for rejuvenation. There are certain shrubs, and there's a list there of shrubs that do well if you kind of prune them down to just a few inches above ground. And I'm going to share in the reference list some really good sources I found for pruning as far as different shrubs, what type of pruning for them. There's different techniques and things like that. And time of year, it does depend for different shrubs. So I will share those in the references. So now, in this final content slide, I want to share some of my thoughts on climate change and gardening in our low desert as we see more and more heat and drought and more extended periods of those two things. I'm thinking about how can I continue to keep my garden healthy and thriving. And so these are just some thoughts. None of them are based on scientific experimentation, but really just some practices and thoughts in the garden that I'm thinking about. And so I highly recommend to get more trees into your landscape. Typically, most of the homes I see in Phoenix metro area, they could use more trees. It's very rare when I see a house where I say, oh wow, that house, they must really enjoy the summer, getting the cooling effect and shade from the trees they have. Very rarely, it's one in a very small percentage of houses do I see that have really used trees, I think, to the way that we can. And I'm talking about ironwoods, mesquites, and palo verdes in particular, those taller trees that offer filtered shade. They are really, really valuable in the garden. And we also know they have a lot of wildlife value, which we've talked on in other segments of the workshop. But I would say if you have significant areas that are getting a lot of sun, especially in the summertime, and this is probably on your west exposure, to get some trees in sooner than later. And that's going to really benefit you and your family. It's going to help bring down temperatures. It's going to make the garden a little bit more livable, especially maybe in the shoulder times of May or June or September when it's starting to cool down already, and that will provide some additional cooling effect. Also, you could think about some on your southern exposure. I think that's going to really benefit both people and wildlife, because having that will also help the wildlife in your yard through the summer season. Also, be thinking about, you know, the most xeric, the most drought-tolerant species, and maybe they deserve a more frequent space in your yard. Maybe they should be overrepresented in the yard, and minimizing the use of the more water-thirsty plants, and maybe confining them to a smaller zone in the oasis area. But thinking about getting more and more xeric plants. And some examples, just off the top of my head, are creosote, brittlebush, perhaps wolfberry. There's a range of different ones. I have a list on my website as well. So that's another thought. Something else I'm doing with that third bullet point, run them hard to exert selection pressure. This has to do with natural selection, but really, I guess, really artificial because I'm doing it. And what I'm doing is, like I've noticed in my front yard that has a lot of sun exposure, I have quite a bit of a bank of seeds of globe mallow that germinate every year. They're pretty robust, but what I've been doing is not watering them as much as I could. And I've actually been subjecting them to what I call a drought selection pressure, and some of them went dormant. Actually, all of them really went dormant in the last summer, and they're only now in the last couple of months coming back, and this is February. So what I'm doing is actually seeing, like, are some of my globe mallows maybe carry a trait for even a higher level of drought resistance? And if so, and if I put this pressure on them, that trait will become more common in the population over time, because that's the plants that will be able to reproduce and thrive under those conditions. So I'm doing that. I'm not doing that for all my plants. I don't think they all will be able to adapt that way, but I am at least testing it with these globe mallows because I know they're already quite xeric already. So that's just another, again, musing from my garden space. I think that shade cloth in the summer, I did that this past summer, and I'm planning to do it again with some of my plants that they do well year-round in the space I put them in, but they could just use a little more help in the summer because I don't have full-on, don't really have full-on shade in those spots, and they're under more stress at that time. So that could be something as well. We might find we need to do that more often as we get more extended periods of drought and heat. Also, watch for what the plant is advertised as being able to take as far as sun, because a lot of plants are listed as partial or full sun. So I would err on the side of partial sun and put it in those type of conditions over full sun, because if it says it can handle either, that probably means it's going to struggle in full sun in the summer. More soil amendments. We talked about how some of the plants in higher elevations can do better in our garden if we've amended the soil. Well, that may be true for all of our plants. We may find that adding more soil amendment, kind of like Mary Irish's practice that she does regularly, might benefit all of us in adding more amendments to the soil to help our plants thrive under harsher conditions. Also, refraining from planting in spring or summer is probably going to become more and more important. There's much more plant loss when you put in plants at those times. It may become just really a difficult feat to do. And this is related. Planting calendars may shift over time. We may find that, maybe September just becomes off the table as far as fall planting. Maybe it has to go further into the fall. Things like that. We may see some of the vegetable planting calendars have to shift. Summer crops, some of our traditional summer crops, such as corn or squash, may have to be grown more in the springtime. So there's things like that to consider. Also, if you have the means to consider rainwater harvesting, there's lots of different levels of that. I mean, some people can put thousands of dollar systems in with roof systems collecting rainwater, but there's even less expensive things you can do. There's shaping the land, contouring was mentioned. There's a really good organization in Tucson called Watershed Management Group that offers information and programs and education on this topic. Gray water reuse, such as some pretty cheap plumbing additions, can divert the water from your washing machine out into landscape areas. So that's another possibility to conserve water. And I hate to think about this, but it's possible that there may be some plants that we just can't grow here anymore under increasing drought and heat, even if they are native to our area. So these are just some thoughts on climate change and gardening, as far as what type of things we may need to think about to continue to have our gardens thrive. So now here's a reference page. I just wanted to mention some of these because these are some important ones. The first three are links to shrub or tree pruning, Really good guides. I really recommend these three. They're really good guides for if you want to think about how to prune trees and shrubs correctly. And then the two Irish books are really good. They're found in a lot of the public libraries. And then Doug Tallamy's most recent book, Nature's Best Hope, really provides a lot of the philosophy for the reason why we want to think about providing for wildlife in our home yards. And then that final reference is the one that's the landscape watering guide I talked about that was really good about providing drip irrigation guidelines and advice. So thank you again. I hope you'll take a look at the other segments of the workshop, and you can find us on our webpage. They're listed. Contact us at the email address below. Thank you.